Jai Prabhuji, hello. We are at the 6th class of the course about the book Experimenting with the Truth by Prabhuji. I am Swami Durgananda, and we are continuing with the article that deals with the master-disciple relationship, an article in which Prabhuji gives us an in-depth explanation, analysis about this relationship, and we come across many aspects and elements in this relationship. And as we go through them, we gain more and more understanding about this phenomenon. So today we are going to read one paragraph and speak a little bit about it. And there will be another class that will be dedicated to this article. A real master is a finger pointing toward freedom. Hence, the master will never meet disciples' expectations. Salesmen try to satisfy their clients. Politicians do their best to keep voters happy. Only false masters fulfill the expectations of their followers. Real ones will continuously disillusion them. That is why so few disciples remain with their masters. Real gurus often have Judas and leave behind a trail of disappointed disciples who could not give up their expectations. So in this point, in this paragraph, Prabhuji talks to us about a very important aspect of the master-disciple relationship, which is not the bliss, the beauty, the fulfillment, the encounter with the master, right? We spoke about it in previous classes, and everything that we read in Prabhuji's word and spoke was right and important. And describes this relationship without a doubt. However, this relationship has also more aspects that it is important to understand them in order to have a complete and deep analysis, and Prabhuji does not dismiss them. He includes them, and in my opinion, this is of utmost importance, not so we understand what happened to Judas or to disciples that maybe do not continue on this path for whatever reason, but so we can observe ourselves and understand better the complication of our encounter with the truth. Not encounter only, our dialogue. Each and every human being has probably a different dialogue with the truth, and in my opinion, when we go deep into the analysis of Prabhuji about the master and disciple relationship, this is relevant to any of us who is interested to go deep into the truth and get help of whatever form of wisdom that derives from realized beings. So if we read a book, if we watch a lecture, if we read a prayer, scripture, this dialogue, if we delve into some religion, our dialogue with this wisdom is in a way our relationship with the master. And all the elements that Prabhuji speaks about in the master-disciple relationship are relevant. So in this paragraph, in the light of these words, we're going to try to deepen a little bit about in this aspect that Prabhuji speaks about, which is not, again, the fulfillment and the beauty, but the complication that can happen and will happen. Because we are not realized beings, most likely whoever listens, and myself, are not realized beings, it means that we are situated in an egoic perspective of reality. We might come in touch with wisdom of truth in this extent of another. We might have some understanding. We might have some beautiful moments in meditations that we feel that we touch something of the beyond. Still, we need to understand that our eyes are still coming from an egoic perspective as long as we are not established in the transcendence. And therefore, these words that Prabhuji speaks about here are relevant to us. What Prabhuji speaks about here is the understanding that realized beings that take upon themselves to guide others, to help others to see, which is a very complicated operation, necessarily will not fulfill their expectations. We need to understand that Prabhuji tells us here, and we need to understand that if a master fulfills our expectations, if we are not bothered, if we are not agitated at some point on this path, if we feel that everything is in line with our desires and expectations, and we are not realized beings, it might be a false guru. Because the purpose of this relationship, the meaning of a guru, is someone who helps us to transcend the ego. Helps us to transcend sounds very nice, but we can, in other words, translate it to someone who disturbs our ego. It starts to be less pleasant. So the meaning of disturbing our ego means to not fulfill our expectations. And this is because when we approach a guru, and when a guru accepts us on this journey together, the understanding of both parties and the desire of both parties is the transcendence of the disciple above the egoic phenomenon, the egoic identification. The mission that both parties have here together is that the disciple will wake up from his, again, dualistic view, egoic identification. And therefore, both the disciple and the guru are entering into some attack, we can say, on the ego, on this image that we currently think that it is us, this identification, out of the understanding that this identification is the source of our suffering. So before we move on, I would like us to remind ourselves this foundation of the relationship that we all enter into in this relationship, the fundamental understanding of the path, of the problem, of the reality, and of course we in a way speak about the things in a gross sense because we speak about very subtle and sophisticated truth that ultimately we can only experience, we can only be. But in order to advance on this path and in it develop intellectual clarity and understanding of what we are doing, we need to use these terms in order to communicate with others, but also with ourselves. So we do speak about it as a problem, as aspiration, although we will hear Prabhuji say in different contexts that this view that there is a problem, that there is a solution, is coming from an egoic way of perceiving. And yet, still it is true that both the guru and the disciple recognize that the disciple is in a state of identification with an egoic entity, and therefore he is not in touch with reality fully. And the attempt of the master, of this individual, is to help him to see life directly. And the desire of the disciple is the same thing. Even though the master is situated in some seeing, so he's coming from seeing everything that we say. He sees that the disciple is not in touch with reality fully. He sees that there is another way to see life and to live life. The disciple is not in seeing, but he understands in some intellectual basic level. And maybe, as we spoke in the previous class, he touched it. So he had kind of an intimate experience that pulls him to enter into this path, both the experience and the intellectual understanding based on words of scriptures of other realized beings. The disciple accepts this fact that he is currently not in touch with reality fully because he is conditioned by his mind, because he is bound to the egoic perspective, because he is perceiving the world through dualistic eyes. He accepts it and understands it. And he desires to transcend it. And he approaches an individual that he recognizes as being established in this seeing in order to help him. This is the basis of this relationship. So to remind ourselves, even though we already spoke about it, we already accepted it, whoever listens to this class for sure has some level of familiarity with this wisdom in this extent or another. Maybe even some have deep familiarity, maybe even explored it deeply, maybe even taught others. Nevertheless, just the fact that we are still egoic entities, which means we are seeing the world through this identification as an entity that each one attributes to it all kinds of characteristics and facts, makes us forget, causes us to forget again and again and again. And this is all the spiritual process, to come in touch with this wisdom, to associate with this wisdom, to aspire to experience it, to go through conscientization, to study again, to remember again, to read again, to pray again. In whatever means, we want to transform our consciousness. So, on one hand, as disciples, we are accepting. We accept that we are in illusion. We accept that we do not see reality. We accept that there is a better, different way to live and to see, and we aspire for this other way. And still, simultaneously, we are in illusion. We accept it because it is true. We are not perceiving reality. It means there is some conflict in us because of an illusion, we're forgetting. And this forgetfulness causes us to think that we know, to think that we see reality, to argue with the truth at times. So there is some kind of a conflict between our aspiration and where we're currently at. And there is some kind of conflict between us and our master, because we are not situated in the same consciousness, in the same seeing. And the retroprogressive yoga tries to eliminate conflicts, to have us observe whatever there is and to accept it and not to aspire for some reality that is transcendental to what we currently experience. And yet, or even thanks to it, thanks to the observation, we can recognize the conflict. There is a gap between where we are situated and where we want to be. And at the same time, we understand that the desire to be something else, the aspiration, is part of the complication. It's part of what keeps us distant from being situated in transcendental seeing, because in transcendental seeing, we are in full acceptance. We accept whatever there is, including the conflicts, including the problems. But we recognize that we are not in acceptance and we want to be in acceptance. So everything that we speak is paradoxical. And this is the nature of this path. Until we will be able to speak from one seeing of reality and not divided, we will be in some kind of conflict and some paradoxical thinking. And this paradox between what we are and what we want to be, between what we touched and experienced and were pulled into when we decided to follow the master, to what we experience when we are resistant in the middle of the path, is what creates situations like in the case of Judas, that, as we said, did not happen only to Judas, but will happen to us. Because we will forget. So the ego, in definition, the nature of the ego is forgetfulness. The ego wants to forget the view of reality with which we entered into this relationship. And we are reminding ourselves here the context in order to understand the point that a disciple that becomes unhappy with his master in the middle of the path, that, as I said, will happen to all of us, is because of forgetfulness, is because of disconnection from the context with which we entered into this relationship. And we disciples, spiritual aspirants, spiritual seekers, want to accept it, understand it, and continue forward with the context, with our original desire. So I would like to remind ourselves, because we understand we are egos, we are forgetting. So we want to remind ourselves the original foundation with which we enter into this dialogue with the master, which is the understanding, as we said, that we are in illusion. So let's visit two scriptures that describe this reality. And we remember that when we enter into this relationship, we have that clear. So in the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali Maharishi tells us in Sadhanapada verse 3, Avidya smita ragadvesha abhinivesha kleshaha. The pen-bearing obstructions are ignorance, egoism, attachment, aversion, and clinging to life. Here Patanjali describes to us our situation of being in illusion. So we get here a list from Patanjali Maharishi of 5 kleshas, or causes of suffering. That this list is not only a list of independent aspects, but we can also see it as sequence, that one leads to the other. And we can also see it as a circle, that is never-ending circle. So let's explain. The first klesha Patanjali Maharishi tells us is avidya, ignorance. The foundation of all the kleshas, the first cause of suffering, is that we are not in reality. This is relevant to each and every human being on this planet that is not realized. We are not in reality. We do not see things as they are. We see a distorted reality. We will speak about it more when we enter into the chapter that will deal with the mind. But currently we are in the master-disciple relationship context. Because of this ignorance, we think that we exist as an entity. So out of avidya, Patanjali tells us, the second klesha is asmita, or egoism, and we mean here egoism not in the sense that I care about myself more than I care about others, but just my identification with an entity means that I am under asmita, that asmita describes me. And again, the origin of asmita is avidya, ignorance. Then I identify with an I. Patanjali tells us this is the second cause of suffering. Just the fact that I think that I exist as an entity. Because there is I, Patanjali tells us the third and the fourth kleshas are raga and dvesha, attractions and aversions. Because I exist out of my identification as being existent, I want many things, I chase different things, I desire, and I escape. I dislike, I reject other things. And this we can recognize as two forces that governs our life moment to moment. This chase after something better, something convenient, something pleasant, something desirable, and escape of pain, suffering, etc. Distress. Prabhuji once explained that these two forces are in fact one movement. We move from the distress into the relief, from the pain into the enjoyment. And again, we see this as something very significant in our existence. Of course, that we want to enjoy, that we want to relax, that we want happiness, and we want to escape pain and suffering. Every human being can easily recognize this. Patanjali tells us these two are also causes of suffering. Because of this, you are agitated. Because of this, you are not at peace. It's another two clashes. And the fifth klesha, Patanjali tells us, is abhinivesha, clinging to life. Sometimes it is also translated as fear of death. We are more attached to this word, to this reality. And now we said it's also a list, it's also a sequence which we already explained. Out of avidya comes an identification with an I, asmita, out of asmita comes raga, dvesha, attraction and rejection. Out of raga and dvesha comes abhinivesha, clinging to life. And we can see here also a circle, because clinging to life causes us more avidya, more ignorance. We are less in reality. Less in reality, we are more identified with an I, more obsessive about this egoic identification. And then we have more attractions and rejections. And then we are more cling to life. And we can see it continuing on and on and on and on. So for the spiritual aspirant, not only he recognizes that this is our current situation, and what else we understand, thanks to the wisdom of rishis like Patanjali Maharishi and others, that there is no way to go out of this circle by fulfilling our desires and escaping pain. We will never go out, we will only strengthen it and strengthen it and strengthen it. Therefore, the spiritual aspirant wants something that is transcendental to all this, that is not related to the egoic entity, to the attractions and to the aversions, but a different route in life. And this is what we call here the spiritual path or the spiritual journey. When we spoke about the Buddha, that he left behind his father and his all the abundance that he had, material abundance, and his future, bright future, and his beautiful wife, and his newborn child, all his duties, he left all this behind because he recognizes, soon you will see in the Buddha's words as well, that this world is a never-ending suffering. And there is no way to go out of the suffering except from the option of transcending this consciousness altogether. And this is where he left the palace, not because he realized being, but because he wanted to search, because he wanted to find it, and he believed that there is something more substantial. This example of the Buddha, Prabhuji gave him as an example. We read it in the previous class. Is the state of the spiritual aspirant. He understands that the dualistic world, what we call the material world, is not going to relieve him or her of suffering and bring him or her happiness, and he seeks a different route in life. This is when we approach a master. Okay, so this context we give because it's the remembrance of the foundation of this relationship. Now let's visit Buddhism. So we'll visit the Four Noble Truths of the Buddha that he realized after he realized the reality, not when he was only a seeker, but when he actually fulfilled his belief that there is something more substantial. He was able to penetrate through the illusory perception of reality and situate in transcendental view, transcendental to the suffering, and then he gave us all the wisdom of Buddhism. So in the Four Noble Truths, let's read them and speak a little bit about them. And we give them as an example, another example, to the foundational understanding of a disciple when he approaches a master, when he seeks guidance, when he asks for help. So the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha tells us, is the truth of suffering. Dukkha, Arya, Satcha. The Buddha says there is suffering. Like in the case of the 5 clashes, also the Four Noble Truths describe the reality of each and every person in this dualistic consciousness. We suffer. We spoke about it in previous classes. The Buddha spoke about different kind of suffering, and he showed us beyond any doubt that all of us suffer continuously. Even when we think that we are happy, successful, etc., the suffering is all pervading in our human experience. The second noble truth, the truth of the cause of suffering. Dukkha samudaya arya satcha. And here the Buddha speaks about the desire as the cause of suffering, Trishna or Tanha. So here we meet the Raga and Dvesha of Patanjali Maharishi. We suffer because we want, because we have preferences. We want different things, we desire. And this causes us to suffer. The third noble truth is the truth of the cessation of suffering, Dukkha Nirodha Arya Satcha. And here, what the Buddha tells us, which is also very relevant to our context of the master-disciple relationship and Prabhuji's article, this suffering is not a verdict. There is a way to live outside this suffering. So first, the Buddha wants us to recognize that there is suffering. If we do not see that we suffer, we need to recognize that we suffer. But then, he tells us, we don't have to continue to suffer. Out of this awareness of reality that we suffer, acceptance of reality that we suffer, facing it, then we can move on into transcending it. So the third noble truth is the truth of the cessation of suffering. We don't have to continue to live in this mundane consciousness, in the cycle of the 5 kleshas. And the fourth noble truth is the truth about the path that leads to the cessation of suffering. Dukkha Nirodha Gamini Patipada Arya Satcha. So the Buddha tells us, in order to go towards this cessation, there is a path. For most of us egoic entities, the path will not be short. Usually it will not be just a glimpse and we got it, because we are identified as an egoic entity, and the path that the Buddha speaks about in Buddhism, he speaks about 8 steps. This is a specific language we can say to this path, but we can recognize the same path in different religions, from different masters, and basically what we speak about here is the spiritual path. The path of contemplation, more awareness, more association with wisdom, of making effort to transcend ourselves, of practicing sometimes sadhana and different practices, of listening to masters, of our attempt to realize the truth, until we hope that we will one day reach this Nirodha, Dukkha Nirodha, a cessation of suffering. Like we see in the case of the Buddha, he had a path, but he transcended this reality, he experienced enlightenment. So we see the point of embarking on his journey, of not knowing, but recognizing that there is something more substantial, and we see the realization. If we look at Prabhuji's life, we spoke about the long journey from what I thought that I am to what I really am. So we see how in Prabhuji was. We saw that there is a long journey. You know, the Prabhuji walked 30 years in search, in learning, in reading, in practicing, in attempting to transcend the dualistic view until he experienced his nature transcendentally to the egoic identification. So we can recognize this path in other human beings as well. And we can recognize the starting point when we decided to shift our direction in life from trying to fulfill the egoic entity, which is what happens in the material world, into the attempt to transcend the egoic entity. This shift is when we approach a master and we want to receive spiritual wisdom. But as we said, usually there will be a process. What is this long process, this long path? Many, many moments that we will forget and remember, that we will be resistant and remember again, because we are egoic entities. And as egoic entities where our expectations are not fulfilled, we're agitated. When we are agitated, we can have different reactions. Of course, Judas is a very extreme reaction, but we can be unhappy. We can suffer. We can be sad. And this is part of the path. But this is a desirable part of the path, because we want this egoic identification to get weaker, to suffer, to diminish, in order for us to be able, hopefully one day, get in touch with life, not through this egoic entity, to give it less importance. We don't want to fulfill the egoic entity. We don't want that the egoic entity will succeed. The Katha Upanishad 1.3.14 tells us, Utishtata jagrata prapya vara nibodata, kshurasya dhara nishita duratyaya, durgam patastat kavayo vadanti. Rise, awaken. Having found the great enlightened masters, one attains understanding. The sages have said that the path is sharp as the blade of a knife, difficult to traverse and hard to travel. So in this beautiful quote from the Katha Upanishad, we see two important points that are relevant to our discussion. One is the importance and the necessity and the immense value of having association with a realized being on this path. The second aspect that we see here is that this path is very delicate, is very sophisticated. This is why we might not succeed it. We might not succeed in it. We might fall at some point, because it's such a delicate path. Let's look again at the words. Rise, awaken. Having found the great enlightened masters, one attains understanding. The sages have said that the path is sharp as the blade of a knife, difficult to traverse and hard to travel. This path, this operation of transcending above our egoic identification is a very complicated one, because we are the ego, and we are also the ones who want to transcend this ego. This is very complicated. This is very sophisticated. This is why we cannot help ourselves to see ourselves. And this is why help of someone else who sees us is so precious, is so important. And we will see that the scriptures tell us again and again and again, loud and clear, how important it is to find a realized being in this path if we want to transcend our ego. How precious it is, how valuable it is, and how difficult it is to do this jump by ourselves. There is one article where Prabhuji does mention that it is possible. It will be in our next class. And still, it is very rare that individuals could liberate themselves. These are really great, great personalities. Even to find disciples who walked on this path with the realized beings and managed to transcend, it's not so common. What to speak about individuals who did it just by contemplating like the Buddha. And I want to read another beautiful quote from Rumi that speaks about this point as well. Whoever enters the way without a guide will take 100 years to travel a 2-day journey. Let's take a look at the beautiful quote from the Dhammapada, the words of the Buddha, number 76. The Buddha tells us, one should follow a man of wisdom who rebukes one for one's faults, as one would follow a guide to some buried treasure. It is always better, and never worse to cultivate such an association. So in this quote, we see again the 2 points. One is how important is this association, how precious, how necessary if we want to go on this path. And at the same time, the value is that he shows us our faults, that he reveals to us our illusion, that he disturbs our ego, or in Prabhuji's words, he does not fulfill our expectations. So Prabhuji tells us, to summarize, the master will not fulfill our expectations. We should expect that the master will disturb us. He will be against our expectations and under our expectations. He will underperform in fulfilling expectations. And yet, at the same time, the Guru takes us way beyond our expectations, way beyond anything that we can even expect as egoic entities. We are like birds who are clinging to the branch on which they sit, and we are disturbed and bothered and afraid from the Guru's suggestion that we will cut this branch because we do not know that we can fly. So in this we will end today's class. Jai Prabhuji.